Guru Nation, welcome back to another episode. Please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Really means a lot to me. We've been going back to the fundamentals now. I've been doing interviews. I've been doing all kinds of site-focused stuff. This is one of the fundamentals. This is going to go in the fundamentals playlist. Everyone in this space needs to learn this stuff, especially if you're brand new, but it's not a bad refresher if you're been around for a while. And sometimes things change, like with the new administration, we have a new FDA in charge, and they're kind of making certain things like rare diseases they've talked about. They did a town hall meeting today. For those watching in the future, it's June 2025. And so this is going to be phase 1 to 4 clinical trials. So we're going to go through every phase, what actually happens, when some of the diseases are different. Like I said, rare disease, now the FDA wants to incentivize to make it a little easier for rare disease companies to innovate. So they're talking about getting rid of the requirement for 2 randomized double-blind trials on the phase 3 side, and maybe just doing 1, or even discussing combining the phase 2 and 3 together for rare disease. So there's always going to be exceptions to these things based on the indication, the disease type. But for the most part, this is the guide that's going to serve you well, I hope. So just a brief introduction. What are clinical trials? These are structured process to test new drugs, biologics, or medical devices for safety and effectiveness in humans. But there are multiple phases, because they progressively gather the safety, the dosage, the efficacy, and long-term data before public release. So typically you have phase 1, and we're going to get through what all of those mean. But not all trials are created equal. The design depends on the therapeutic area. For example, cancer, you're not allowed to use placebo. Anything that's going to put the patient's life at risk, you cannot use placebo. And don't get me started on the companies that have tried and thankfully haven't been allowed to by the ethics committees do placebos on all kinds of stuff that you would think are inhumane. And in fact, they are. And this is why we have ethics committees in place too. So you cannot give placebo to a life or death medical condition. If it's oncology, you test the investigational product versus the current standard of treatment. Usually what they do is combination of things. Combination therapy plus something else, or the investigational product in with a combination therapy. Oncology studies are like a completely different beast, but we are going to cover some of that in here because there's first line, second line, third line treatments, which most other conditions don't necessarily have. Now, a cancer trial might fast track patients with no other options, while a vaccine might enroll and need to enroll 30,000 healthy people. So let's break it all down. Again, I'm trying to keep this very beginner level to make it simple. So phase 1, safety and dosage. So the goal for phase 1 are to test basic safety, how the drug moves through the body, which is called pharmacokinetics, and how it acts on the body, pharmacodynamics. So those are 2 different things, PK and PD. Both very important. Typically, you'll see PK being used a lot when you're comparing one drug to another, because maybe one drug was already approved and you already know what the acceptable therapeutic range is. For example, in epinephrine, we already know there's been a lot of studies on epinephrine. And so we know the therapeutic range, we know the brackets, where you need the minimal effective dose, the maximum tolerated dose. So anything PK-wise, pharmacokinetics, how it moves through the body, you know that the sooner it starts working, the better for something like anaphylaxis shock. But then also has to maintain at that level for a certain period of time. So how the body treats the IP, and then how the IP treats the body, which is pharmacodynamics. So in oncology, which are basically half of all trials are oncology, you sometimes have patients with late stage or treatment resistant cancer that would participate in the phase 1 studies instead of healthy volunteers. Why? Because Ethically, these patients are at their last resort, and this is usually late stage. When you're talking about things like late stage or treatment resistance, you've already tried other therapies. So, this whole idea of right to try that the industry has been pushing, and rightfully so, and the new administration is going to continue rolling with this. It's These are the ones that do phase one. So, with the exception of oncology and sometimes psychiatric trials where patients are already hospitalized, phase one studies are usually done on healthy volunteers. Now, there are examples where rare disease studies use small patient populations. Maybe there's only 100 patients in the United States. So you're lucky if you can get like 10 of them. I mean, that'd be like 10% of everyone with this condition enrolled in your study. So in those cases, because they are smaller patient populations, they might combine a phase one with a phase two into a single protocol. And that's why you'll see phase 1/2. Those are for rare disease or harder to find patients. For everything else in phase one, they're using healthy volunteers. And the healthy volunteers really get no benefit out of joining that study other than compensation and contributing, so altruism, contributing back to the field, contributing back to science. There's two kind of designs. There's more than this, but just to keep it simple, single ascending dose and multiple ascending dose. So single ascending dose, otherwise known as SAD, is gradually increasing the dose among the groups, whereas multiple ascending dose is repeated the dosing to assess cumulative effects. And so those are the two trial designs for phase one studies. These usually last several weeks to a few months in the case of a cancer trial. Some of the phase one healthy volunteer human studies don't even go a full week. They go like 3 to 5 days because they're literally just testing what's the maximum dose that patients will tolerate, so MTD, maximum tolerated dose. And they're looking at the single ascending dose, multiple ascending dose, whether they're using those different cohorts. And then they're seeing the differences of the PK, the pharmacokinetics, and the pharmacodynamics. Once the whole purpose of phase one is safety and dosage, and that maximum dose that patients can tolerate, MTD. Now, why is that maximum tolerated dose important? Because if you already have an idea or a hypothesis, if you're the sponsor, for what dosage you need for therapeutic benefit, you want to make sure that is much lower than the maximum dose that a patient will tolerate, because these are healthy volunteers. So if a healthy volunteer patient can't tolerate the dose, how would a patient with a medical condition, who's by definition not healthy, tolerate the dose? So the MTD has to be a lot higher than the proposed therapeutic dose range. And that's exactly what phase two does. So let's say we find maximum tolerated dose in phase one. Now we know the therapeutic dose that we're hypothesizing falls well below the maximum tolerated dose. So it's ethical to do the phase two study, which is a dose optimization study and early signs of efficacy. And this is to test whether the drug works in patients with that target condition, and of course gather more safety and dose response data. So you're still doing PK, you're still doing pharmacodynamics. You might even be randomizing patients on different arms. So you won't go to the maximum tolerated dose that was established in phase one. That would be crazy, because that's the dose that is proven by the phase one study to give patients side effects. And so you're going to go well below that, but you may want to test with precision which dose works best and study this in aggregate. So usually these are 100 to 300 patients with the therapeutic condition. So if you're doing a study like COPD, you already found maximum tolerated dose from phase 1. You're well below that dose for your therapeutic range now, and you might be testing between 2 milligrams to 4 milligrams. I'm just using hypothetical numbers here. Let's say maximum tolerated dose was 12 milligrams. Phase 1, most healthy volunteers are fine with side effects until you get to 12 milligrams. So now you know in the phase 2, you're not going to go anywhere near that 12 milligrams, but maybe you're going to try 2 milligrams, 4 milligrams, 6 milligrams on patients, see which one works better. Then midway through the study, and this is called a adaptive trial design, you could figure out, okay, it seems like the 4 milligram dose is where the most benefit is. Let's do the 4 milligram dose. Maybe you found out the 2 milligram dose, you're not getting any therapeutic response. So you get rid of that because you have enough data now to where you don't need to enroll more people. Again, it's all, if you follow good clinical practice, you don't want to do harm to patients. So the beneficence of the trial design would be, let's get rid of the 2 milligrams and go 4 milligrams and 6. And maybe we found the most therapeutic efficacy is at the 4, because at the 6 you are seeing more side effects. In those cases, they may run with both of those arms, or they may do a confirmatory trial if the FDA tells them. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. 100 to 300 patients with this condition. In oncology, these are open label, so not blinded. Everybody knows what they're getting. You're either getting the investigational product or the standard of care. In something like COPD, what you would get are double-blind trials. So the patient would not know if they're getting placebo, if they're getting the standard of care, or if they're getting the investigational product, and which dose of the investigational product they're getting. So in the example I gave of the COPD trial in this phase 2, let's say you're testing the 2 milligrams, the 4 milligrams, and the 6 milligrams of the investigational product. That's 3 different arms. But then you also have the standard treatment for COPD, which is already approved and on the market. And then another arm would be placebo. So you would have 5 arms on this study that's double blind, meaning the patient doesn't know what they're getting, nor the researchers know what they're getting. The only people that know what they're getting are the sponsors because they have the blind code, so they know what everyone has been assigned to. So these studies, if you're a site, are more complicated to do just because there are so many arms. And then there's usually stipulations, like if a patient at week 6 or week 12, the way some of these trials are designed, if they were on placebo, they're going to be switched to standard of treatment. And if they were on standard of treatment, they might be switched to placebo. There's different ways to test for these things to see whether the IP actually impacts the therapeutic effect and the safety. So they're the most interesting kind of trials to design, I think, are in the phase 2. I'm not an expert in trial design, but there's a lot of flexibility in the phase 2 studies because you're finding the right dose, you're optimizing the right dose, sometimes in real time, and then you're looking at efficacy. Does it actually work? And of course, safety always. Now, for rare diseases, sometimes they use historical data instead of randomized comparators. So you may have rare disease where there's only 10 patients in the whole study, and instead of using comparators, you look back on those same patients, do retrospective chart analysis, and then look at the comparison between the study drug. Now, there's 2 types of phase 2 studies. There's 2A and 2B, and I've kind of explained both of them together, but 2A explores the efficacy and early signals, and phase 2B refines the optimal dosage. So when I mentioned in this example, this hypothetical of 2 milligram, 4 milligrams, 6 milligrams for COPD, that would have been a 2A. Once they figure out it looks like 4 milligrams and 6 milligrams are best, and they get rid of 2, now it becomes a phase 2B, and they can actually do another trial on just 4 milligrams maybe. So now you have 3 arms of 4 milligrams standard of treatment or placebo. Sometimes phase 2A and 2B studies are combined into one if the FDA never allows or not allows, but the FDA will strongly give, I guess they're not even called suggestions. Our guest guru, Darshan Kulkarni, would tell me the FDA just kind of implies or makes it to where the sponsor would understand implicitly, like, hey, we can't combine the 2A and 2B, or we can. And so if you're a site and you're participating in a phase 2A/2B, just know that there's going to be some dose adjustments throughout the study, maybe on the same patients or maybe on future patients. And if you're in a 2A without a 2B, you're probably not getting any dose changes throughout the same course of the patient, but you're going to expect a phase 2B study afterwards with the right dose that unfortunately you can't enroll the same patients in it, because most of those studies are designed to where patients who participated in the phase 2A could not join the phase 2B. But these are usually months in duration. And typical success rate to phase 3 is only 30%. So for every 10 studies that make it through phase 1, so I forgot to mention this, 70% success rate to phase 2 from phase 1 to phase 2. So it's a lot easier to go from phase 1 to phase 2, because 70% of the trials from phase 1 successfully go to phase 2. That means the maximum dose that's tolerated for the patients is a lot higher than the hypothesized therapeutic dose. So 70% of those, 7 out of 10, make it to phase 2. From phase 2, which I just explained, to phase 3, the success rate is only 30%. So this is the filtering out phase. Like, you know how in college organic chemistry filters out people that think they want to go to med school from the people that actually go to med school, is like difficult classes like organic chemistry. Well, phase 2 is like the organic chemistry version for studies, because only 30% of trials are successful in phase 2 that even go on to phase 3. So usually they find that the dose that they thought was the therapeutic dose doesn't work, or maybe it's not safe enough. Usually it's that it doesn't work, and there's no clear improvement of efficacy from the investigational product to the standard of treatment. And now phase 3 trials, these are the large-scale efficacies and safety studies. These are also called pivotal trials. If you ever hear that term pivotal trial, that's what it is. Why is it called that? Because it's the last phase before the company submits the NDA to the FDA for approval. So if you make it to phase 3, even making it that far, you are a really good candidate. And the typical success rate to actually file, not to get approved, to file, so you had a successful phase 3 trial, we think we're confident enough to file an NDA, new drug application, to the FDA, is 60%. So 40% of them say, you know what, we didn't like the data, it's not worth our time or efforts to even send this to the FDA, but 60% of them do. And from these studies, you're confirming the drug's effectiveness, you're monitoring the side effects in a larger population, much larger, usually 300 to several thousand patients, and you're gathering the data for regulatory approval. And so this is where more sites are used. This is where closer to real-world patients are enrolled. In phase 2 studies, one thing I forgot to mention, that the inclusion-exclusion criteria is still relatively strict. So you're not getting like real-world patients with, my example was COPD. You're getting like more rare cases of patients that have moderate to severe, maybe COPD, but then all their other bodily functions and systems are relatively normal, which is not the case in the real world. In the case of the real world, every body's system impacts another in some way over time. That's what chronic disease is. Chronic disease is a systematic breakdown of multiple body systems. So COPD would actually cause heart disease, and it may cause other issues due to inflammation and things like that. So you are kind of cherry picking patients in phase 2. In phase 3, it's less cherry picking. So the inclusion exclusion criteria is more inclusive, but it's still not always equal to real world patients. There are disease specific differences as there are in all the phases, but in phase 3, cancer may require endpoints like overall survival or progression-free survival versus just things like tumor shrinkage, especially now with this new FDA regime. So again, it's 2025 for those watching in the future. They are adamant that they want to see overall survival for oncology, and they want to see progression-free survival. Now, a lot of oncology trials are granted provisional approval after a successful phase 2, especially if it's for an unmet need in oncology. So usually last line treatment, metastatic. There's individuals that really need that medication, so they open it up for phase 3, but it's provisional approval, meaning only through the trial, and they may take that away if the phase 3 data does not line up. So what does that data look for in oncology studies? Overall survival, how long do the people live? And progression-free survival, how long until the disease worsens? Now, in non-oncology studies, what are they looking for? If there's already existing treatments on the market, they're looking for an improvement. They don't want, and it has to be an improvement either in the safety or the efficacy, ideally both. But they don't want to approve something that is just as good as something else that's already on the market, and maybe it's already generic. They want a significant improvement, and the FDA is not actually transparent as to what they're looking for, unfortunately. And according to Darshan Kulkarni, who's a friend of the podcast, they don't like to box themselves in. But it's implicitly understood by all sponsors that you need to have an improvement in either safety or efficacy, ideally both, if there are other treatments. If there are not other treatments, of course, if you can demonstrate some benefits to society, you're likely to get approved. Now, phase 3 are often conducted globally across dozens, sometimes hundreds of studies. Vaccines tend to enroll tens of thousands of patients, and usually these are healthy individuals. They track disease incidence over time. Cardiovascular disease, which I'm on a few of these right now, phase 3 pivotal trials. The endpoints may take years to observe, so they may be looking for things like heart attacks or strokes. How long were we able to prevent that versus someone who was on a placebo? I'm on a study right now. It's like a 5-year study where they're looking for exactly this, cardiovascular outcomes. And so every therapeutic area has their own kind of gold standard for what they're looking for as far as their endpoints are concerned, as far as their efficacy assessments, and as far as their safety assessments. So if you're someone trying to learn the industry, this is a macro overview of the phases, but you really need to hone in on your therapeutic areas because each one, the studies look for different endpoints, different safety assessments, different efficacy assessments. Now, phase 3 are the same as phase 2 and phase 1, randomized, usually double-blind, except for the case of oncology, and then placebo or active controlled. Again, in oncology, the control group is the standard of treatment. In conditions where they are not immediately life-threatening, you can use placebo. Multi-center trials across geographic regions, After this phase 3 is done, the regulatory submissions occur. So this is the new drug application, or in the case of a biologics, the biologic license application, a BLA. It takes anywhere from 1 to 4 years to complete one of these trials. And then the typical regulatory filing afterwards is another 6 to 10 to 12 months. The typical success rate to regulatory filing is 60%. That doesn't mean that's how many are going to actually get approved. How many actually get approved are much lower than that, of course. I think the last number was like 25%. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that one. And then phase 4, post-marketing safety and real-world data. Sometimes, like I said, drugs get approved conditionally. That's called conditional approval, meaning FDA says, yes, we'll approve this because there is definitely an unmet need, and this is clearly there's something here, but we want to see this. We want to see a post-marketing safety study, and we want to see real-world data. And these are generally easy trials to pull off, but because there's so many patients required, it is still costly for drug companies to do this. And thousands to millions of people, maybe after the product is approved and marketed. But because it takes so long to do these trials, the patent protection is basically generally expires like 7 to 10 years, depending on the actual patent. 4 to 10 years. Every drug's slightly different. But some of these phase 4 trials are exactly that long. So there's no real incentive all the time for the drug company to even complete these things, but just enrolling people in very easy phase 4 post-marketing safety and real-world data studies, they're still getting the drug to market. Of course, they want to sell it to market too. I've been involved in phase 4 studies where the drug company provides the drug for the phase 4 participants free of charge. I've also been involved in phase 4 studies where the patient is supposed to pay for the drug. So as a side owner, I obviously prefer the former, where the patients don't have to pay for the drug. But in cancer, you see this a lot. And then in other indications, you see this requirement to remove a black box warning. So maybe in the phase 3 study, a recent, slightly older example of this is Zyprexa, the antipsychotic. It was approved like in 2007, I think, for schizophrenia. And it was a conditional approval with a black box warning. The black box warning said it may cause diabetes. And now no doctor is going to be comfortable prescribing that with a black box warning unless there's really no other treatment options for that patient. Of course, the drug company wants that black box warning removed. So they have to do the phase 4 study and show enough data from the real world data to get that black box warning label removed. But in oncology, phase 4 studies are given all the time. And so you see this a lot. These are relatively easy studies to do. Safety surveillance, registry, open label, potential label expansions sometimes. Although if you really want a real way to do a label expansion, like if you're going from COPD to asthma, let's say you got approval for COPD and you want to go to asthma, sometimes you can bypass phase 1 and 2 and go to phase 3. Sometimes you can't. It just depends. And you'll have consultants and you'll have meetings with the FDA where you can kind of figure it out for yourself. And the duration of these are ongoing for years, sometimes decades. And so discovery to approval, typically 10 to 15 years. The overall cost for one drug to get approved is $1 to $2 billion. So it literally costs, like if you think of any drug that's popular, let's say Ozempic, which is on everybody's mind right now. Ozempic, just for obesity, not for diabetes, not for heart disease, just for obesity indication, cost $2 billion, I would guess. And it took probably 10 to 15 years to develop that. That means it's like $2 million every day. That'd be like you going to the casino every day for 15 years and betting $2 million every day, not knowing if you win. and doing that every day, weekends and holidays included, for 10 to 15 years. And then at the end, you find out if you want or not. So when people ask why are drugs so expensive, that's why. Imagine doing that, going to the casino every day and doing that, and not even knowing the outcome. You'll find out in 15 years if you want or not. And these drug companies are crazy enough to do that. That's their job. And so that's why drugs cost a lot. And this current administration obviously has a problem with that. And yeah, it's not a perfect system. Most favored nation. I've done podcasts on that. But it's a risky business. Again, 70% make it from phase 1 to 2. 30% make it from phase 2 to 3. 60% submit for approval. And overall, less than 10% of drugs that ever enter phase 1 get approved. So imagine that casino analogy, but I'll tell you at the beginning of your 15-year journey, you're about to do all this every day, 2 million, every day for 15 years. You won't know the results, and only 10% of people that do it win. But then they win big, like you're talking about multi-billion-dollar drugs in some cases. And then you can start doing other indications where you can maybe bypass phase 1 and 2 and go to phase 3. So that's it. I mean, there's adaptive trials that I've discussed where you can modify study parameters in real time. These are very popular in oncology and rare disease. I think they'll become increasingly more popular. There's platform and basket trials, so shared infrastructure for testing multiple drugs or indications. The big pharma do this well. Decentralized trials where they allow patients to do some study visits at their house or do telehealth or wear some wearables so you can get some data that way. AI is going to be used a lot in our space for patient recruitment, for site selection, for monitoring the metrics, of course, in real time, and then real-world evidence trials. So I'm not going to do a recap because I kind of spent a lot of time on each phase, but like, subscribe, comment, share. Let me know what you think about this, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.